doing good for the living. That's today's talk. And so we stand here basically on the other side, firmly on the other side of the centennial of World War I. And of course, very close to Memorial Day as well. So it makes the topic somewhat appropriate. And the topic of living memorials is right at the heart of what one might call shadow history or hidden history. Hidden history is kind of a History Channel term, kind of marketing-y, but we'll call it shadow history. And what does that mean? Essentially, as a topic, it's pretty obscure, either from a general narrative of how we choose to remember those who fought or died for a cause, in this case, democracy or saving democracy somewhere in the world, or in a physical sense, insofar as, do we know where these things are, these symbols of memory, or are they hiding in plain sight, which in the case of yours truly was very much the case. The bottom line with a topic like this and today's talk is that history and how we choose to remember it is essentially temporal, right? It's a time-based discipline. And if we don't revisit it, we may lose touch with that. And when the history dies, part of us and our cultural heritage dies as well. So here we are talking about this topic, which I find fascinating. There's not been a whole lot done on it. And by the way, we talk about things like this because is the Sacramento Room is a public agency that's asking you to spend time with us. We don't want you to just sit there and hear about things you've already heard about or topics you've already explored. We want to introduce something to you that's pretty unique and hopefully fills a gap. And in the case of this, we'll get you outside, exploring your city. So let's start by talking about origins. There we go. And hopefully our PowerPoint is going to cooperate. And, you know, why are we here? Well, the seminal event, to some, George Kennan called this the most catastrophic event of the 20th century. He wrote that after World War II. So the images you see in front of you, this troika of images, are all relative to Sacramento. And what you see are people with lives, people with families, people with hopes and dreams. To the far left of the frame is a fellow named Hiram Albert. And High, as he went by, registered with the National Army on June 5th, 1917, in the Curtis Oaks area of Sacramento. He then was assigned to the 91st Infantry Division, the Pine Tree Division, and then went off to Tacoma, Camp Lewis, where he trained with the 91st. He actually took the picture in the middle, and that's Doughboy, a doughboy, series of doughboys marching down K Street in the spring of 1919. And originally I couldn't place it, but if you look to this upper part of the frame right here, you may notice that as Weinstock Lubin on the lower part of K Street before it moved to 12th and K. So these fellows are coming back, as did Hiram. To the far right, we have Hugo Wallner, who registered on June 5th, just like High. Hugo was a bank teller at the California National Bank, eventually went off to Camp Lewis. And both Hugo, the gents in the middle, and Hiram all participated in the September 1918 Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which was the largest American military action of the Great War. Hiram came back, the fellows in the middle came back. Hugo did not. He died of a gunshot wound during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. He actually is interred at St. Mary's in East Sacramento. So Sacramento obviously has an emotional stake in the Great War. And the question has to come to the fore in 1919 and 1920 of how these fellows are going to be remembered. And by the way, in addition to Hugo, 134 other Sacramentans living in the county at one time gave their lives. So how will memory be perpetuated? How will it be symbolized? And these two fellows are very interesting in that regard. One of whom you will recognize to the right, the other one to the left, not so much. The one on the left, Frank Crane, a Protestant minister, but also a pretty big journalist, heavily syndicated column all throughout the country during World War I and then after. And he wrote in July 1919, and this was picked up in the Sacramento Bee, on how best to remember America's Great War dead. And he contended that for most of recorded history, mankind, humankind, had been nothing more than a tomb builder. And how much better it would be if we could get away from this idea entirely and put up memorials for the dead that should keep their memory green in a much surer way. And simply put, green sentiment was eloquently put, but also very, very popular in America after World War I. And his way of thinking quickly made way for this idea of the living memorial. Don't worry, I'm going to define it very soon of what a living memorial is. And in this so-called living memorial, the gentleman on the right, that's TR Teddy Roosevelt, would, in the words of TR, take the form of doing good for the living. So, two things in play, both symbol and the perpetuation of memory, but also function and some sort of utilitarian use in the context of a rising young American society and community. But, yikes, what America had done in the past to memorialize war dead, and of course, in this case, we have the American Civil War, was freckle both the North and the South with these bronze and granite cenotaphs, monoliths, statues that, quite frankly, were quite unattractive. And so I think the nation at this point, post-World War I, was looking for a rhythm step towards something new. Critic Charles Chaney, a critic of the old way, but just a general journalistic critic, wrote in 1919 that these Civil War memorials, and he minces no words with this, were often of such poor inspirational or artistic appeal as to become an incubus to the community possessing them. So, harsh but fair, I would say. If you've spent any time on the East Coast or in the American South, fair words. So that didn't change the fact that there were business interests. As you look on the left, the ad on the left was taken from American City, which is a dynamite trade magazine for urban professionals. It lives fully scanned and in the public domain on archive.org if you want to take a look. That was still a thing. And of course, we are a capitalist society. And so there is money to be made by marketing your wares to those who make America's cities go through, of course, American City. And then to the right, we have Ernest McKesney's Spirit of the American Doughboy, which I think is nothing more than a perpetuation of much of what we saw created during the American Civil War. 150 cities across the country said, yeah, we'll go with that. We'll do it. And so that old paradigm of bronze and granite, to some measure, was still there. But as Andrew Shankin, who is a historian, a sociologist at UC Berkeley right now, basically said, was the sentiment and the support of the traditional memorial was overwhelmed by this new idea of the living memorial. And this is basically what we have. We have the living memorials right here. So we go from these very sort of staid, pedestrian, sometimes overwrought symbols of war that maybe a country just wants to forget. Those aspects of war and remember sacrifice in a more positive way. And so we have over here on the left, the far left, we have what were known as Liberty buildings up the top and to the side. This is a little boy turning over soil for an oak at the Honor Grove in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. To the far side here, we have victory trees being marketed by Rockland Nurseries in New York. And then down at the bottom, we have this, I love this image of this cool little gas station along the Victory Highway, what would have been known as a road of remembrance in that period post World War I. So we have Liberty buildings, we have victory trees or victory elms, victory oaks, and then we have roads of remembrance. All of these things, while being symbols, remembrance of those who'd sacrificed, are also meaningful, functional parts of a society on the rise, an American society entering the 1920s. Aviation is taking off, auto travel's taking off. It's a brave new world in so many ways, and it's all about the future. And so we're leaving these sort of Gilded Age ideas of, bronze memorials and Napoleonic doctrine of war making. We're leaving all that stuff behind, and we're moving ahead. So as you can see, as you look at these images, we've got the complexity of architecture to the left, but we also have something as simple as a tree. We often see cases in the Sacramento Bee or Sacramento Union of these very simple gestures of planting a valley oak, somewhere in the upper northern valley to memorialize a fallen soldier. The tree might, and a series of trees might eventually grow up to have value in terms of providing shade or possibly even being a windbreak to protect crops during that time. So living memorials are here to stay. And as you can see, they run a wide spectrum of types. So This is a very, very tough needle to thread, but I'm going to give it a shot. And we're going to talk a bit about context and the idea that living memorials hardly occur in a vacuum. There's a reason why they're here with us. Most of it has to do with architecture and schools of architecture, but also governance, mostly good governance. And we're going to use, of course, Sacramento, San Francisco, and Chicago as case studies for building this base for our living memorials. So it was since the late 19th century that TR, who we saw earlier, his progressives, the Bull Moose Party, and his allies had been trying to systematically solve away the surfeit of issues facing American cities, and all the problems attached with the nation's quick hyper-urbanization and the accompanying population surge. And progressives, in a thumbnail, in a quick shot, a nutshell, when we talk about the progressives, we're talking about anti-monopoly, a group that thinks anti-monopoly, anti-immigration, stopping vice, obviously had a huge influence on prohibition, also stopping political corruption at the municipal level, taking on the boss systems, Tammany Hall, right? And streamlining government, bringing a sense of science and efficiency and measure to how things are done. And so they were problem solvers. Bill Mahan, the late great William Mahan, professor at Sac City College, looked at them as the quintessential reformers of their time, not without blind spots, awful moral blind spots insofar as racism. Of course, we see C.K. McClatchy right here, a progressive, and we also see Hiram Johnson, a progressive. Certainly at the micro level, we've got C.K. handling things in Sacramento, but we have Hiram Johnson, of course, at the state level as governor, and then at the national level as a U.S. senator. CK was a zealot when it came to the progressive cause, promoted and pushed politicians toward city government. Clinton White would have been probably the most high-profile progressive candidate who did ascend to the post of mayor, up against the old boss system, usually represented by Marshall Beard. But the progressives were here, and they were going to leave a mark, especially when it came to bringing order and some element of calm to a city like Sacramento that was urbanizing and industrializing, and its population was exploding massively. So physically, if you look around Sacramento today, you can still see these elements of progressivism. The idea was that if you could build these beautiful, beautiful structures, these temples of governance, good governance in the American city, you could often inspire virtue and better behavior in the denizens of your city. So if you look to the far left, we have City Hall in Sacramento, kind of a Rococo style building, a lot of filigree. We have the place where I am right now. In fact, if you look to the far right, that Romanesque window, that's probably below that window, I would be sitting right now. That is the City Library, 1918, 1911 on City Hall. And then in 1922, we have parks. And another sort of idea of the progressives was that the availability of green belts, place of refuge, places of recreation, make city living better. And it's a way to provide succor and outlet to workers within the city. So we have tremendous influence in the development of Land Park, also Southside Park, and that's in addition to all the Sutter park grants that Sacramento was born with, basically. And also Del Paso Park saw some development under the progressives in Sacramento. And then, of course, over here on the side, more into the mid-20s, we have the water filtration plan. So it's at this interesting confluence of progressive thinking and trying to make cities better, and then also the need to recognize the sacrifices of World War I, that we see this really amazing emergence of the living memorial. So let's move on. And one more thing, the City Beautiful movement, kind of a precursor to progressivism. And the gentleman in the center right here is Daniel Burnham, probably one of the most influential architects of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, a classicist, also believer in the Beaux-Arts movement. He was formative when it came to, if you look to the upper left-hand corner, the 1893 World's Fair, which was held in Chicago. It was much more than just H.H. Holm. If you've read Devil in the White City, it was the birth of a movement, the City Beautiful movement. And then down here, you know where that is, the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, and born out of the Pan-Pacific 1915 fair. Both great examples of the City Beautiful movement and the idea that, again, we can inspire virtue in all of our citizens to want to do well, maybe not drink that drink, but do right by your fellow citizens and move toward a more productive future. Okay, so let's move toward our first example, Liberty Buildings. When it comes to Liberty Buildings in Sacramento, we got to look at this fellow right here. And this guy is Clyde Seavey, probably a name you've all heard, you probably recognize it. And Seavey is important because he is Sacramento's first city manager. In 1921, the city charter has changed. We go from a commission system to a city council with 9 members and a professional, a trained professional, apolitical, just there to get the job done. Let's go ahead and have someone who can run the day-to-day business of the city outside of politics, and Clyde Seavey was that person. And of course, at this time, he's overseeing this hyperpopulation growth in the city of Sacramento. In fact, between 1910 and 1920, Sacramento sees a 50% increase in its population. That's in addition with the expansion of SP, canneries, and then also state government is also expanding as well. So, and I forgot, 13 public schools. So Mr. Seavey is extremely busy. In addition to that, of course, he has the water filtration plant. The SP train station is being put in. And so, again, an opportunity for Sacramento and someone like Mr. Seavey to incorporate progressive philosophy and the City Beautiful movement and this idea of living memorials into not just observing the fallen, but also growing the usefulness of structures in the city. Twofold accomplishment. And numero uno is what we know so well, Memorial Auditorium. Done by Dean and Dean, finished in 1926. That's why I love this picture so much, brought to us courtesy of the California State Library, just putting in sidewalks, finishing up the area around. Of course, many of those trees are gone. But the idea is that we have this temple of democracy, right? We have this place where not only do we remember the fallen, if you go inside this building on the north entryway, as you look forward, you can actually see an honor roll. It's a very common term at the time, an honor roll of Sacramento's fallen. And it's daring, right? Architecturally, you've got a mixture of a bunch of different styles. You have a Byzantine style. You have sort of an Italianate, Greco-Roman style with the porticos in the front and the frieze. And then you also have the Corinthian columns. And then there's a touch of the Alhambra, Spanish touch. If you look at the Romanesque windows over at the far left side, where you have the hewing of that stone sort of like alternating, that's very much a Moorish style of architecture. So Dean and Dean bring this, and it's beautiful, and we know it's there to remember the fallen, but it's also there to promote the cause for which these 135 Sacramentans died, and that's the democratic process of having these public venues. So we have everyone from Marian Anderson coming to sing, to Paul Robeson acting Othello, right, in the Memorial Auditorium, to American Legion smokers. One time every year, the American Legion could use Memorial Auditorium, no charge whatsoever. And then, of course, today, one of the coolest things I've seen going by Memorial Auditorium, and this would do the heart of every single person who had a role in making Memorial Auditorium work, it would do their heart good to know that Americans are sworn in. Citizenship ceremonies are held at Memorial Auditorium. So it's an amazing structure. It's certainly the largest Liberty Building or living memorial within the Sacramento Valley. Not in Northern California. I think you've got to give that to the Legion of Honor, the Art Museum in San Francisco. I was very disappointed when California History from the University of California Press came out with their World War I issue, and they had a catalog of World War I memorials, a select catalog, and they didn't include Memorial Auditorium. That was very disappointing because it is without a doubt a gem. And talk about hiding in plain sight. When I first came to Sacramento 20 years ago, I thought for sure this was a World War II living memorial. And I had no idea that it had some connection to World War I, its strongest connection, of course. So our second Liberty Building, you may recognize this, you may not. This is the Memorial Vestibule. To get into the California State Library, the library being the quintessential democratic institution, you have to go through the Memorial Vestibule. And so the California State Library is where that is. It opened in 1928. And of course, it's beautiful. It's very earnest, of course, when you walk through. The acoustics are amazing. Visually, you have these columns made of Italian marble, Indiana limestone to the back and to each side. And then there's also a really fascinating mural up at the top along the molding, the upper molding, if you will, of the vestibule. And that's basically the history of war from prehistory all the way to the American Expeditionary Force. So what we have here is we've got a very classical style, a very common form of architecture. You know, we think of Daniel Burnham. This is the kind of thing that he would have approved of. Basically, on each side, we've got an urn, and above the urn, it states, "This house of peace shall stand, excuse me, while men fear not to die in its defense. So, as I said, a very, looks like we've got Janet joining us. Sorry, everybody, I warned you, but I am back now. Welcome, Janet. So, so this is the vestibule. And again, to go through it, you have to get to the library to go through it. And in doing so, you enter a tax-funded, completely open institution where you can look at any book you want. There's a beautiful reading room on the upper floors, and maybe not as open as free as the public library, but again, something that, again, you know, a democracy goes to war for, and to many worth dying for. So there you have the vestibule. Now, a little bit closer to there we go. A little bit closer to my native past, and that would be Portland, Oregon. We have the Liberty Temple, which is obviously very non-Sacramento, but it's so fascinating, I wanted to go ahead and include it. The Liberty Temple, as it says in the card here, was built in one single day, Sunday, March 10th, 1918. So contractors from all over the city of Portland donated labor and material to build this structure, which, if you've been to Portland, it's on the west side of the Willamette on roughly 5th and Morrison. Today, it's a completely different city. But the Liberty Temple, again, we have the invocation of that classical style that was so popular at the time, with connectivity to the ancients and the birthplace of democracy. And so from March 1918 to the spring of 1920, the Liberty Temple was either a recruiting place or a place of processing, but also a place where returning soldiers could go and find a job when they got back to Portland. And it's also a place where the American Legion, a post-World War I organization, would actually have its meetings. Very short-lived structure, by the way. So here in March 1918, but gone by the spring of 1920, wasn't meant to last any longer than that. But it definitely had an element of memory to it as well, because Americans were dying as early as November 1917, the first three, Hay, Enright, and I can't remember the last name, were killed in a German raid. So there's an element to memory to this as well. So Liberty Buildings, everyone. Oh, and then I should say that most of these structures were privately funded. Memorial Auditorium, not so much, a lot of tax money going into it. Same thing with California State Library, obviously. But you would find Liberty Buildings all over the country that were funded with private money. And so you didn't have a lot of federal money being thrown in, but you did have the federal government providing counsel on how to do things. And this is the cover of a pamphlet from the Bureau of Memorial Buildings War Camp Community Service. This is a publication that was at the University of Illinois, found it on archive.org. So when it came to planning, financing, finding labor, contractors for your Liberty Building, this public agency was there to help out. So kind of an afterthought, but sort of an interesting thing. Okay, so let's talk about Victory Trees, the truest living memorial, right? And it just so happens that Sacramento is a perfect place for Victory Trees. So this is a picture that we saw earlier. This is, again, the Honor Grove. in San Francisco, in Sacramento, there were already memorial groves before World War I. Of course, all you have to do is look to Capitol Park, and there were trees planted to honor those felled during the Civil War. But in the case of World War I and in the case of Sacramento, it was in 1930 that the city's parks department, worked in tandem with the local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter to ensure the planting of 300 trees, just a stone's throw away from what today we call the Victory Eagle on Freeport. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But all of these trees being planted in Sacramento would be done expressly as memorials to those who gave their lives, Sacramentans who gave their lives in Europe. And they were a cross-section of deciduous trees, larch, maple, elm, also hornbeam. And the seeds for these trees, where did they come from? They were brought over from the battlefields of Europe by members of the local VFW. And then they would be planted along what was to be known as Memorial Drive. Okay. And so you would have basically this road of remembrance called Memorial Drive going right through Land Park. And basically the base, the westernmost base of Memorial Drive is Riverside. So Riverside and 11th Avenue, and Memorial Drive is basically 12th Avenue. Okay, so that windy road that's intended to go right through Land Park from Riverside all the way over to Freeport. Okay, and 300 trees, victory trees, liberty trees would be planted to honor the fallen. And then a brass tablet would be placed down at the base of every tree. And I can tell you, folks, if I can find it right here, I even have the document right here, that on December 12th, 1929, the City Council voted to name that road Memorial Drive. I can assure you there is not a single sign on that artery that identifies it as Memorial Drive, unfortunately. So this idea of the Memorial Grove. Now, I'm going to take you out of Sacramento and to what I regard a fascinating case study, and that is Cleveland's Liberty Row. And it's the same idea. And this is a picture right here of Vice President Calvin Coolidge planting a memorial tree in Cleveland. And the idea of Liberty Row was basically to have an avenue run from, let's see, the name of the park, Gordon Park. Okay, Gordon Park, right at the shores of Lake Erie, runs south 14 miles all the way up to Shaker Heights. All right, and along that road would be 800 trees. And every Clevelander that gave their life in the Great War would have a memorial plaque base or set at the base of a tree. And as we stand today, Liberty Row, by the way, has been renamed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. But as we stand today, about 200 of those original 800 trees are still there. Check this out, everybody. So this is an example of the far right of what you would see on Liberty Row. In the center, we have an example of what they had thought of doing, right? With Memorial Drive and Land Park, but did not happen. And we'll get more into that in a second. And then the city of Cleveland went ahead, no private money with this, the city of Cleveland went ahead and provided interpretation. at the centennial of Liberty Row, which I think is an extraordinary accomplishment, especially based on what I said earlier about the temporal nature of history and memory, and the need to keep it less malleable and keep it more present. And so these symbols, these interpretive symbols really, really help, I think. So there we are. I would also add that there has been an effort across the nation. The commission created by Congress at the base of the centennial has now created something called the Doughboy Foundation, which had, I think it's still alive actually, an initiative called 100 Memorials in 100 Cities, where basically $200,000 of grant money would be given out, provided that the money given out could be matched. And I actually thought about doing this for the Eagle, Victory Eagle Memorial over off Freeport. The problem is I called the city of Sacramento and no one knows anything about it or who's taking care of it, which is tough news, tough news to get. Okay, so let's move on. So again, Victory Trees, there is a financial incentive for nurseries nationwide to promote Victory Trees as a way to not only beautify your yard, but provide a symbol and a nod to those who gave the supreme sacrifice. So one nursery in Tarrytown, New York, close to Washington Irving country, states, let's see here, whether they gave a boy or not, you can plant a tree as a memorial to the victory over Hun and Hell. And they offered to sell a set of 10-foot high Colorado firs for $95. So there's financial incentive in there. But yet again, it was the simplest thing to be able to do, if indeed you had a connection to the Great War and you had a loved one living or fallen that you wanted to memorialize. So Victory Tree is very popular. I know that in North Sacramento, there were Liberty trees planted. Here is a headline out of the Sacramento Bee that talks about windbreak, being put into Yolo County because the winds obviously being so strong were damaging crops. And so the idea was, well, why don't we go ahead and set up a series of windbreaks, but also call them Liberty trees as, again, a nod to the fallen and being a symbol of sacrifice, but also having utility and having function in this brave new world. So Victory trees. Let me take a look at time here for a second. Okay, I think we're doing all right. So roads of remembrance. And of course, I mentioned earlier the importance of Memorial Drive, but America is changing at this time. We are a country that has discovered motor travel. I mentioned earlier aviation being a thing. And so in the post-war period, this immediate post-war period, this is a time for Americans, larger incomes, earlier retirement dates, shorter work weeks, of course, and longer vacations. And this is all time that people can fill with activity. And what else are you going to do? But you may actually go ahead and hit the road. And so this is a section out of the Sacramento Bee. All of a sudden in 1926, actually earlier than that, we have the auto and outing section, just copious, filled with so many sections of information that will help you make that road trip to Placerville, up into Desolation, up along the Yuba River. Make that trip a little bit easier. Everything from better tires to, I had to include this, snake bite antidote, which was really a thing, obviously right here, taken out of the, and manufactured in Sacramento by Kirk Geary and Company. So Americans are on the move at this time. And probably the greatest manifestation of a Remembrance Road is none other than the Victory Highway, which is intended to stretch from San Francisco all the way to New York. One person referred to it, or one contemporary publication referred to it as one of the greatest memorials in history that connected these two great cities, and of course, everything in between. And this is a really great graphic right here, because what it shows you is you've got tandem highways, right? Like a couple of lazy snakes thrown across the country. So we've got the Victory Highway, but then we also have the Lincoln Highway. And there's quite a bit of competition between both of these organizations, both supported by private organizations, trying to get travelers to travel on their road. There's financial incentive to do so. So the idea with this whole thing is that it's, again, this is not a road built so much with federal money. There's a lot of private money going into it, and a lot of private money going into beautifying. And this is kind of a cool image here. So these two fellows right here, they are Dan and Faye, and their charge is to basically have this goodwill trip along the Victory Highway and basically hammer in 5,000 signs. So do all the signage from San Francisco to New York. Actually, it was from Pikes Peak to San Francisco and then all the way to New York, these guys. And so this is June 1921 in San Francisco in front of the Palace of Fine Arts. Yeah, anything they can do to make it easier to find a pull-off along the Victory Highway. And then there's this guy right here, the father of the Victory Garden movement in America. This is Charles Lathrop Pack, who headed the Victory Garden Commission under Herbert Hoover, who was in charge of the U.S. Food Administration. Pack, rich guy, huge influence within the timber industry, but really believed in the value of planting trees as victory trees, as memorials, and helping to beautify America's roads, and in this case, the Victory Highway. So we can go ahead and we can help build this road and keep it well maintained, but it was really up to Americans at the micro level to go ahead and plant beautiful flowers and plant trees and have other very patriotic elements along the Victory Highway. Part of this was this thingy right here. And of course, this is the Victory Eagle in William Land Park. And the idea behind the Victory Eagle was that hundreds of these were to be put up along the Victory Highway from New York to San Francisco. And with each new county that you entered, you would see a Victory Eagle, and then there would be a plaque, an honor roll, if you will, of the fallen on that Victory Eagle. And this is Sacramento's right here. Shockingly, only 6 Victory Eagles were made. California has 3, and Kansas has 3. So California has one in Sacramento, of course, on Freeport Boulevard. And then there's one in Antioch and one in Truckee. So yes, very few of these ended up being planted, but this one was put in on Armistice Day in 1926, the Sacramento Women's Council. As you can see in this picture, there's a lot of space between 21st Street, aka Freeport, and the memorial today. I want to say 1957. Freeport was expanded, so now it runs right by. I mean, it's a clean shape a clean close shave if you're standing there today along Freeport. So Freeport is part of the Victory Highway, and just off the top of my head, Victory Highway, as it goes through Sacramento, you're going, let's see, El Camino west to Del Paso. You take Del Paso south, you cross the American River, connect to 12th, go down 12th to F, and then you're going to go east on F to 15th. You take 15th to L, yeah, and then L over to 21st, and then you're on Freeport. I think that's it. But if you're on Freeport, you're on the old Victory Highway. And so here you are, this beautiful, well decorated, patriotic highway takes you through Land Park, along Land Park, the beautiful new junior college is put in. And then what else do you see? You see Victory Acres. So approved of in 1927, incorporated into the city eventually in 1953, but Victory Acres was a residential development along the Victory Highway. Again, you know, the flowering of memory through these functional, you know, representations of democratic life. It's still there, folks. You know, not as pronounced as it used to be, but the street names are still there. So if you look at this assessor's map right here, you can see probably the main drag. So you've got Southern Pacific Line over here, Freeport over here, but Belleau Wood, where the Marines fought and made a name for themselves, as Teufelhunde in June 1918. You also have Thierry Road. I have to think that that's a misspelling, but very popular to name streets after these battles. There's also a Kitchener road up north, a little bit further up into Victory Acres, named after Lord Kitchener. And then there's also a Pershing street named after John Blackjack Pershing. So memory, day-to-day memory. It's obviously meant less to people as time has gone on, because most of us wouldn't know what Belleau Wood was, or Chateau Thierry, or Lord Kitchener, or John Pershing. And then as you go further down, this jewel, folks, as you go further down Freeport and go into the village of Freeport, you have the Victory Elms of Freeport. So 15 miles to the south of the Victory Eagle. This is a picture I took. Carrie Odo, who's a resident of Freeport, told me, go north of the city, you'll see a couple of original elms. I'm assuming these are the ones. They probably are, so I took a picture. The elms were prevalent enough and green enough and lush enough that through the 20s, through the 60s, they provided this deciduous tunnel, for lack of a better word, as you drove through Freeport. Drive from the hot of Sacramento into the cool of the Victory Elms as you went through Freeport. Again, symbol of memory, but also function. And again, like the Memorial Drive seeds brought over from Europe, these were too, or so the legend goes. The Dutch elm disease of the 60s and 70s devastated these trees, as you might guess. So these are our living memorials in Sacramento. Again, I went ahead, and let's see if I can do this. I'm going to go ahead. I've attached. I'm going to attach it again. Sorry, everybody. We're going the wrong way. see if I can get this. There we go. So I attached that Word document that's going to have a map, several maps actually. So here's the State Library vestibule. Here's Memorial Auditorium, which almost ended up over on 10th and I before they decided on that Sutter Park grant at 15th and J. And then here is another map. Again, you know, here's the Victory Eagle on Freeport. There's also a women's memorial, which was dedicated right before World War II started to all the women who sacrificed during the Great War. And then there's also a War Mothers Grove situated, bear with me here, between 12th Avenue or 12th Avenue or Memorial Drive and 11th Avenue, and then Riverside and 13th Street. And there's a flag that's still there, a plaque. There's also a plaque over at the Women's Memorial, which would be basically at 13th Avenue and Park Road. So hopefully this map will help. And then our final map right here, Victory Acres, right here, you can see Kitchener Road, Cherry, Pershing, Wilson. I can't place Wilson within the World War I context, but then Bellow Wood right here. And then Victory Elms, this is Bing Maloney Golf Course. The Victory Elms are also, there's a portion of them along Bartley Kavanaugh Golf Course as well. Okay. So let's see where we are here. And then what about memory in general? How do we remember these things? So ironically, a lot of the green living memorials were gone. And so a lot of the sort of like shunned physical memorials. Oh, maybe President Wilson. Sorry, I'm just jumping here. That camping photo. We will come back to that in a second, Jillian. Maybe President Wilson, Melville. It's a good question. We'll come back to that in a second. But in terms of these much shunned traditional memorials, this is the over-the-top memorial of my childhood in Astoria, Oregon. It's still there, whereas a lot of these green memorials have just gone away. Or if they're there, they're hiding in plain sight. People don't know what they are actually. John Paulding, just like Visquesney, a sculptor, went ahead and sold off about 55 of these over-the-top memorials to cities across the country. And I can remember being a little boy taking trips with my grandfather down Highway 30, and we'd go right through Astoria, and we'd look up and I'd say, oh my goodness, look at that, it's a doughboy. And sort of got things going in terms of what is that, what does it mean, what is the meaning of it all. So memory, oh boy, here we go again. I'm sorry, there's issues. So here we go. Yes, memory is malleable. So this is Romano Aquila, a Roman eagle that was discovered in near a West London tube stop, mind the gap, if you will, in roughly 2013. 2,000 years old, created from limestone from the Cotswolds. And so why do I show this? I show this because even physical memory, efforts to create physical memory can be passing, right? Until, of course, they're found, and in this case, by accident. So the idea is to revisit these topics as much as we can. So even though the physicality may be hiding in plain sight, again, the Memorial Auditorium, there it is. Oh, that must be a World War II thing. Well, no, not so much. Definitely World War I all the way. Even though these things may be hiding in plain sight, we have to revisit them. We have to talk about them. And we as historians, all of us, have a duty to point these things out and pay it forward to our friends, even to strangers, if you can. So if there's one big takeaway when it comes to the living memorial and this very precocious idea of a country blazing toward the future in culture, technology, aviation, auto travel, it's going to be the idea of the living memorial, right? And so again, from my childhood in Oregon, the Sunset Highway, Highway 26 from Portland to Seaside is not named so because of its east-west transit. It's named so because of the 41st Infantry Division, the Sunset Division, and the Oregonians and Washingtonians who joined it in an effort to fight both in World War I and in World War II. We can look around different parts of the country and see these roads of remembrance not having anything to do with World War I, but it's a concept that was born out of World War I. So, oh my goodness. Let's see, the Purple Heart Trail, which you can see run right along Interstate 5 through the Sacramento Valley. There are Purple Heart trails from, like I said, the rice paddies of Sacramento to the suburbs of Louisville, Kentucky, all symbols of a functional democracy and the freedom to move and the freedom to get from point A to point B in a democratic society. There's also Highway 37 in the section. Randy Boltz, a peace officer who was killed in the line of duty. So that is the essence of the living memorial. Its birth out of the City Beautiful movement. It's sort of co-opting by the progressive movement. Its manifestation during the Great War. I should say that historian I spoke of earlier, whose name escapes me, but the article that he wrote is in the document that I provided you, that I'm going to upload again. Basically, the living memorial came back to life during World War II. So you can find living memorials about the country that are relative to World War II. So let me go ahead and upload that set of maps again. All right, everybody. So there you go. So take a look at that. It does have a list of suggested readings. And last but not least, the last. Thanks for joining me. So I'm